I think Watch Dogs is one of the most fascinating franchises in modern gaming. It's an IP that has been shrouded in controversy since its very inception, with a history that forever changed the way video games are marketed to us. On top of that, it's a highly unconventional trilogy, where each entry barely resembles what came before it. But through all the ups and downs, Watch Dogs managed to become pretty successful. That is, until Ubisoft reportedly put the series on ice in 2024. This is the story of Watch Dogs. And this is the story of how not to save a game. It's June 2012, and developers all around the world are preparing for the biggest gaming event of the year, E3. Nintendo are promoting their successor to the Wii console, PlayStation are showing off gameplay of their next big AAA title, The Last of Us, and Xbox are still trying to convince us the Kinect is cool. But the announcement that would captivate audiences more than any other would actually come from Ubisoft. It was here that the French publisher would show the first look at their brand new IP, Watch Dogs. The game would star Aiden Pierce, a cold-hearted protagonist who just so happens to be a highly skilled hacker. Using Aiden's abilities, the player would be able to access the entire city's infrastructure, using it to your advantage. That concept already sounded great, but for anyone who wasn't quite sold yet, the upcoming gameplay showcase would quickly change their mind. The 10-minute demo was breathtaking and looked unlike anything we had ever seen before. Aiden could access personalized info on every NPC he encountered, interrupt cell service to create distractions, or even manipulate streetlights, causing traffic accidents in real time. The possibilities seemed endless, and the idea of an entire game and open world centered around these different interactions was tantalizing. But perhaps even more impressive than the gameplay features were the visuals. Watch Dogs was absolutely stunning. The details of each individual character model, the lighting, or even just the way objects would react to the wind outside was awe-inspiring. In fact, it looked so much better than anything else on the market that many wondered how this could even be possible on modern hardware. Ubisoft did confirm the demo we saw was running on a high-end PC, so it was fair to assume the console versions would not look quite as good, as this was often the case. However, there was an entirely different gaming storyline happening that complicated things. At the time, PlayStation and Xbox had not yet unveiled their next generation plans, but with the PS3 and Xbox 360 entering their 6th and 7th years on the market, we all knew something was coming soon. It was reaching the point where every upcoming game getting announced could realistically line up with those new consoles. In the case of Watch Dogs, Ubisoft couldn't say much about these plans until the console manufacturers did, but they explicitly said the game was being developed with unreleased gaming systems in mind. And so with that, many began to theorize the Watch Dogs showcase had been our very first look into what would be possible from the 8th generation of consoles. Since we knew nothing about those machines, it was impossible to refute this, and Ubisoft didn't exactly do anything to lower those expectations. They let the hype build, using it to keep the conversation flowing in their favor. Once the next generation consoles were officially announced, Watch Dogs was promptly confirmed for them, including a prominent appearance at the PlayStation 4 reveal event in February 2013. With the game looking just as incredible here as it had 8 months prior at E3, the excitement continued to grow. Watch Dogs was seen as the quintessential next-generation game, and for many it was the must-have launch title alongside their new systems. Unfortunately, fans would have to wait just a bit longer, as Watch Dogs would receive a delay to May 2014. It was pretty disappointing to see the highly anticipated game miss the next-generation launch window, but that disappointment would end up being nothing in comparison to what was coming next. In March 2014, a NeoGAF user posted a GIF to the gaming forum showcasing the stark visual difference between the upcoming final product versus what had been shown back at E3 2012. This sent the community spiraling, wondering what in the world had happened here. A member of Ubisoft sent out a series of tweets denying the claims of a downgrade, but what gamers were seeing with their own eyes said otherwise. Just 2 months out from its long-awaited launch, Watch Dogs was now navigating a massive controversy. Ubisoft continued to insist things would all work out, and fans had no choice but to keep waiting and hold out hope that they were telling the truth. When Watch Dogs did finally release on May 27, 2014, it received decent scores from critics, generally in the 8 out of 10 range. Certainly not bad reviews by any means, but maybe not the industry-changing revolution it had been hyped up to be. Much of the criticism stemmed from the story being a bit flat, with a shallow main character who was not particularly engaging. I found both of those claims to be very accurate and had a similar experience. But I did think Watch Dogs succeeded in being a fun sandbox open world world where you could pull off some pretty cool stuff. There was, of course, one other glaring problem, though, the very obvious downgrade the final product had received. Videos flooded the internet showing just how much within the game had changed. Even on the highest end PCs you could find, Watch Dogs looked nothing like the gameplay demos Ubisoft had shown. As you can imagine, the console versions were even worse off. Now, Watch Dogs was far from the first time a game overpromised, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but the levels to which it did so were pretty egregious. And when you consider the fact it had been touted as the crown jewel of the next generation, it's understandable why this particular example stung the gaming world in such a big way. Because this was more than just a little snafu that people forgot about a week later. I believe Watch Dogs forever changed the way games are marketed. In the wake of this release, companies were a lot more careful in specifying when something you're seeing is gameplay, in-engine footage, CGI, or whatever else. Obviously, this is a problem which will never fully go away, but it did seem a little less common for developers and publishers to blatantly lie following this release. The trend I've noticed that may be even more tangible, though, is the added cynicism within the gaming community. I feel like Watch Dogs was a real final straw moment for many. It was the last time they allowed themselves to go all in on something and truly believe. In the years that followed Watch Dogs, it seemed every new game reveal was treated with cautious trepidation instead of full-on excitement. It was automatically assumed any new game that looked too good to be true probably was, and now more than ever, fans felt AAA companies always had bad intentions. In the decade plus since this debacle, the increased pessimism has morphed itself into a gaming ecosystem that is more miserable than ever, but I suppose that's a topic for another day. We now know a lot more about what exactly went wrong with the development of Watch Dogs, and most of it boils down to upper management mistakes and the dev team simply dreaming a little too big. According to Watch Dogs creative director Jonathan Morin, Ubisoft and CEO Yves Guillemot essentially forced them to show Watch Dogs at E3 2012, even though the team felt it was a bit early. Part of the difficulty here was that they knew Watch Dogs was going to be a next-generation game, but as we mentioned earlier, no public info was available about those machines yet. With this in mind, senior producer Dominic Way said the E3 2012 demo we saw was their attempt at predicting what could be possible without knowing if it really was. When spun like that, it makes the Watch Dogs marketing scandal seem more like an innocent mistake than some kind of evil master plan to trick everyone. And maybe from the perspective of the dev team, that was true. But at a publisher level, it's hard to believe. Watch Dogs wasn't some isolated incident. Ubisoft had a history of downgrading their games around this time, and the simple fact that the game was also going to be released on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 meant there was no realistic way it was ever going to look like that. Regardless, Watch Dogs was now the poster child for broken promises, and so it would not have been a surprise to see the IP go away for good. But the truth was, when all the dust settled on the technical concerns and pre-launch marketing miscues, Ubisoft was still left with a highly successful game. Watch Dogs became one of their fastest selling titles ever, totaling over 10 million copies by the end of its launch year in 2014. And despite all of the negativity, many did feel Watch Dogs laid a decent groundwork for the future. A sequel that could better capitalize on the original promises or refine the gameplay systems that did already work well was highly intriguing, and it wouldn't be long before we got to hear more about what was coming next. At E3 2014, Ubisoft stated they now considered Watch Dogs to be a franchise, all but confirming something was in the works. 2 years later, Watch Dogs 2 was officially revealed, and it was immediately clear that a whole lot had changed. In fact, almost everything about this game seemed like a direct response to the mistakes of the original. Right off the bat, this sequel sported a much more colorful art style. Instead of being set in a gloomy, rainy city with a depressed main character, Watch Dogs 2 would take place in sunny San Francisco with a much more lively cast. Another focus would be deeper hacking systems, allowing for improved creativity in mission solutions or world interactions. But perhaps the biggest change of all would come from how the game was being marketed. Watch Dogs 2 was given a release date of November 15th, 2016, just around 5 months after its first reveal. There would be no years of trailers, flashy showcases, and press releases. This time around, Ubisoft would smartly let the game speak for itself. When When the sequel did release in November, it received fair reviews, once again getting a lot of 8s. It was praised for improvements to gameplay, setting, and driving mechanics. There were some technical issues holding the game back, especially on PC, but these would eventually be patched out. The big question mark, though, were the new characters and tone. I call it a question mark because this is something that will be totally down to your own personal preferences. For me, these characters worked and were more fun to be around than who we had in the original. For others, they were cringy and annoying. I do think anyone going back to this game now might struggle with the general tone because it's very much a product of its time. It has a lot of mid-2010s meme culture infused into it, which has unsurprisingly not aged all that well. With the writing style of AAA video games continuing to be a hot topic right now, Watch Dogs 2 will probably not be viewed very positively going forward. But in the moment, it was pretty cool to see a game incorporating this kind of humor, at least for an internet-obsessed teenager like I was. The game was another resounding success commercially, selling over 10 million copies by 2020 according to a Ubisoft earnings report. However, they had created a little bit of a problem for themselves. Watch Dogs 1 and 2 had completely different vibes, leading to a divide in their community. This is a really dangerous spot for a franchise to be in because it will be almost impossible to make a game that pleases everyone. Why don't you ask the Saints Row series how it goes when you build a completely segmented fanbase? Similar to Saints Row, Ubisoft would need to make a choice on what direction to take this IP going forward. Ground themselves back in realism or go all in on the insanity. Well, funnily enough, in a decision that was also quite similar to Saints Row, Ubisoft found a way to pick a path that angered both sides at the same time. The third installment of Watch Dogs was once again going to be making a ton of changes. Most notable of all was that Ubisoft's Toronto studio would now take over as the lead developer. Ubisoft Montreal, the previous overseers of the franchise, would move into a support role. Announced at E3 2019 as Watch Dogs Legion, this entry would take place in London and have a unique approach to playable characters. There would not be any one main protagonist. Instead, any NPC you saw in the world could be recruited to your hacking crew and join the resistance. And when they said any NPC, they really meant any NPC. From former trained army specialists to old ladies, whoever you came across could become playable, each with a specialized background and skill set. It was a pretty cool idea, and if pulled off, could be highly impressive. It also felt like a fitting evolution of the IP, since Watch Dogs has always placed a focus on the NPCs and their characteristics. Unfortunately, it didn't quite come together. Upon release in October 2020, Legion received the lowest review scores of the trilogy. Much of the criticism came from this play as anyone mechanic. In Ubisoft's quest to make sure any NPC you saw can become playable, they all just end up feeling extremely dull. They often have bare minimum qualities or personalities, an obvious side effect of trying to pull off such a massive feat. When creating a game where everyone you see needs to be playable and part of the story, it becomes nearly impossible to put together a coherent plotline. And with the entire idea being that these characters you recruit can live or die at any time, it was pretty difficult to connect with any of them in a meaningful way. I can absolutely see the vision of what they were going for. Ubisoft had experimented with multiple playable characters and permadeath before in games like Zombie U, and the Legion's use of different characters is a good representation of their themes that anyone can be part of the change they want to see in the world. But they probably would have been better off crafting a more traditional cast of characters who could then also work in tandem with randomized NPCs. Either way, Legion's problems did not end with its characters. Fans found missions to be boring and repetitive. The city felt lifeless, and the hacking possibilities were lackluster. It's also worth mentioning that people were pretty tired of the Ubisoft open world formula by this point, adding to the frustration. The game did receive some well-liked post-launch support, largely because it included the return of fan-favorite characters from prior entries, but in the end, it wasn't enough to turn things around. Legion reportedly sold 1.9 million copies in its first 3 days, but Ubisoft never released any further official sales numbers. I assume if they had something positive to report, they would have, meaning it's safe to say the game underperformed. Some have suggested the final number may be around 5 million, which is certainly nothing to sneeze at, but it's significantly less than the 2 games that came before it. And if you needed any more convincing that Legion didn't hit the way Ubisoft had hoped, the current state of the franchise should provide more than enough proof. On April 21st, 2024, a reputable Ubisoft leaker known as Jonathan claimed the Watch Dogs series was seemingly done, partly due to the underperformance of Legion. Multiple different projects within the series had been cancelled, and the IP was shelved for the time being. Considering we are now coming up on 6 years since the last mainline entry and we've seen nothing new, this statement by Jonathan seems correct. Ubisoft has continued supporting the franchise in other media with books, graphic novels, and even a movie that reportedly started filming in 2024, but it seems they aren't too interested in another game at the moment, which leaves us with the question of how. How did a series with so much potential end up dead after just 3 installments? Obviously, the original game's downgrade disaster didn't help things, but I actually think it goes much deeper than that. What I see from the Watch Dogs trilogy is that Ubisoft didn't really have any idea what they wanted to do with this franchise. They started with a really good and poignant idea about surveillance and our sense of privacy in the new age world of tech. They also had a fantastic gameplay concept centered around allowing the player to manipulate the open world through hacking. But past those 2 starting points, I'm not sure they ever had anything else. With each entry, you can see them trying to find that something else. Will the series be dark and serious like Watch Dogs 1, maybe more lighthearted and comical like Watch Dogs 2, or should there be less of a character-focused approach that leans more on general world building like with Legion? In the end, each different attempt seemed to come alongside its own different issues, never acting as a true launch pad for the future. And with each entry being so significantly different, the series was never able to find a real discernible identity past hacking things. But the real damage as a result of so much change from game to game is that every Watch Dogs fan was left with a version they personally preferred, making it very difficult to create a game that could make everyone happy. For as many people who thought the depressing tone of the original was off-putting, there were just as many who felt the eccentric nature of the second game was lame. I think Legion attempted to be the bridge between, since you could theoretically choose to recruit a team of whoever you wanted. A decent compromise, but one that hurt the quality of the game. And with worsening sales from Legion, I can see why Ubisoft pulled the plug. It's interesting that they keep supporting it with other media though, because that shows they clearly believe there is something there. And I would agree. My vision for a 4th entry is something like this. Have a main cast of characters that are defined in their roles, and then also allow the player to recruit specific side characters if they want to, like in RPG. They can build out the team how they want, whether that's serious or silly. But again, have a main cast as well that can keep the plot together so you don't run into the problems of Legion. As for the story, why not have them take on some AI tech company? That seems pretty fitting right now. I'm just spitballing here, but the point is, I think Watch Dogs as a series has more to give, and I hope someday we can see that come together despite all of its previous flaws. I hope you enjoyed this episode of How Not to Save a Game. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, it helps out the channel a ton. And let me know what games I should cover next in the comments. Thanks for watching.